Hi everyone, welcome back to today's episode on The Culture Gap. We are in New York and I am actually waiting for one of my guests to arrive to record our episode together. So this is going to be our usual solo episode that sits in as a filler between our guests. And today we're going to be talking about New York and the psychology of big urban cities. So as you guys know, I live in London and I feel a special connection to New York because New York always feels like London on steroids is how I describe it. And one thing that I noticed walking around New York is that as much as it's a geographical location, you have a completely different psychological state of mind when you live somewhere like New York or London in how you approach daily life. And there's a writer called E.B. White who I think described New York perfectly. And he described it as roughly three New Yorks. So there's the New York of the person who was born here, who kind of takes it for granted. I do the exact same with London, even though I wasn't born there. The New York of the commuter, who's kind of swallowed up by the city each morning and spat out at night is how he describes it. And thirdly, the New York of the person who came here from somewhere else looking for something, whether it's a holiday like me, whether it's someone that immigrated here to build a different life. You're someone that's kind of arrived here searching for something. But whichever one you are of those three, places like New York and London charge a tax on your living. And my question is how much of that tax is paid in psychological currency rather than just money? Because if you look at somewhere like New York, you've got 8.5 million people. My question is how we pay that tax of living in a place like New York and London in terms of a psychological currency rather than the money that we part with. Because somewhere like New York, you've got 8.5 million people. You've got 300 square miles, thousands of microstimuli in every single block. You know, whether it's billboards, street food, sirens, you know, the gust of hot air that comes from a subway grate, which I still haven't figured out why it happens here and doesn't happen in London when we've got our own underground system. But anyone that's interested in human behavior, I think New York and London are huge, massive psychological experiments that are just waiting to be looked at. And I think to understand the mind of someone that lives in a big city like this, you have to look at the bones of the city. So how places like this were formed. So for example, if you take New York, it wasn't built to be a calm sanctuary, right? It was built for commerce. It was built for people to come and make money. And in 1811 is when the city planners laid out the grid for Manhattan. And what they did was they systemically flattened hills. They buried streams. They drew rigid intersecting streets, and New York became very much a vertical world to live in. Eventually, these grids were flooded with millions of people, and a lot of them were immigrants. So the Lower East Side was densely populated at one point with Jewish, Italian, and Irish immigrants. And in the past, they were packed into very poorly ventilated, dark tenements, which some of you might still resonate with. Zero privacy, high rates of communicable diseases because we're all living so close by, and constant noise. But this is exactly where community-born resilience begins. The same thing that affects our mental health in a negative way is also something we end up relying on. And I think that's what we then appreciate about places like this. So when it's so cramped to live inside, life spills out into the streets. So you've got people sitting on the stoops, people hanging out in fire escapes, people meeting each other on the street and building a community that way. And in that sense, your neighbors kind of become your extended family. So you've got your bankers, you've got your therapists living next to you, you've got your shopkeepers living next to you, and you can't really avoid the world around you. If we fast forward to the mid-20th century, that's the era of Robert Moses. And Moses built expressways. And these are going through kind of vibrant, established neighborhoods. Now, if we look at the Cross Bronx Expressway, it literally cuts the Bronx in half. And that was constructed in the 1950s. So what that ended up doing was it displaced, thousands of people across the city overnight in terms of their commute to work or commute to wherever they were trying to go see their family. And what happens is when you change, tear apart, rebuild a neighborhood's fabric that way, and the way it affects society, people then get displaced in a way that their mindset changes. People are ready to move whenever they need to. Your lease is up? Okay, let me just find another place. So you become almost nomadic within a city, which sounds strange to say, because usually people think of nomads as people that are hopping between different countries around the world. but it's the state of how we live in New York and London now. Now, one thing that I wanted to touch on is the cultural similarities between London and New York, because you guys have boroughs like we have boroughs in London. And one thing I've noticed is how culturally condensed some of your boroughs are. So for example, if you look at Queens, it's one of the most ethnically diverse areas on the planet, I would say. And we've got very similar places in London. So for example, you've got Brixton, which has a huge cultural history, Black Caribbean cultural history. You've got Southall, which has a huge South Asian community and history related to that. And I think from a cultural psychology perspective, it really means that people emigrated here to create these safe spaces, these ethnic enclaves, and built a new community that reminded them of home. And that's what they appreciated. But it also means mental health wise, we carried some of the way we talked about illness. So in traditional South Asian households, for example, people tend to somatize their mental health struggles. So rather than saying I'm depressed, they might say my body hurts. Rather than saying I'm anxious, they'll say I've got a tummy ache. And that you can see is very much prevalent in places like London when I see patients, which you might, expect not to kind of move with communities abroad. And it does. And the other thing that I think is very similar between London and New York is the cost of living. So the cities have become increasingly expensive in an almost prohibitive way, which makes it really difficult for people that grew up in London to stay there. And I'm sure it's the same in New York. And one thing that your new administration has managed to do, the Mamdani administration, is move on this directly. I just saw that they've established a rent freeze on your 1 to 2 year leases. And the Historic Rent Guideline Board did that very effectively. And we've had similar movements in London where we had more kind of renters' rights coming in, which I think is really important because mental health security is very much related to your social security, your housing security. And not to say that all mental illnesses will disappear if housing is sorted, but it definitely helps. And all of this is happening among the ongoing migrant crisis. So we still have that issue in London where there's a very anti-immigration rhetoric going on. And I think New York struggles with that as well, with the way the current government is moving. But again, you've got local administrations trying to do their best to combat that and make sure that this is a country and a city that celebrates the different cultures that live here. So all in all, what's the antidote, right? When you live in such a busy city that tends to never sleep, that drains you of your money, how do you survive? From my opinion and observation, I think it is community. I think the same thing that stresses you out is also what helps you out. And for us in London, I said New York community is vertical because you guys all live in these, very, very huge tall flats. For us, it's more kind of labyrinthine. And actually, there was a 2023 paper by King's College London that describes this kind of cognitive load variance where people try and figure out how your city works, right? Where do you find community? Suddenly, it's really narrow roads, and then suddenly it's a huge plaza, how that works. But I think within that stress, we find each other and we find people to rely on. We find people that we can relate to. And that's what keeps us going in places like this. So yeah, my guest has now arrived. So I need to go back to my actual episode. But I hope you guys enjoyed this little tidbit and keep following and listening for more. Thank you.